Last month, I laid out where I wanted the roads on the layout to go. So this month, it's time to start paving. I decided to only work on the west side of the layout, as it's the most finished and settled on what industries are going to be placed where. With that said, I did carve the road running down a slope off the western edge of the layout. I'm thinking I'm going to build some edge scenery, like blocking mountainsides coming in later on that edge. So to have the road run down to the valley between the two ridges would add a little visual interest. For the gravel company, I poured a concrete pad using thick strips of foam board with the paper sides removed. I just used PVA glue to hold them in place, and I also used wedges of foam to build up the road that would cross over the tracks. For the actual roads themselves, I found this 1/8-inch thick foam tape at a big box craft store. It is listed as permanent bonding. I think it's for picture hanging or something along those lines. But I found if you stick the tape to your t-shirt a couple of times, the lint from the cotton in the shirt will make it less sticky. We'll see how that works out later. I loosely kept the rows to around 2 inches or 25 feet in scale for 2-lane roads and about an inch for the one single lane that I'll have near the covered bridge. Now comes the messy bit, trying to get the drywall compound to stay within the foam tape and lay flat. Covering the tracks with drywall plaster was nerve-wracking to say the least. But I figured if I screwed everything up, it would be a learning experience, and all it would do is require me to pull everything up and relay some track. In the end, I think it worked out okay. I used a set of old metal trucks to make sure that the flange space on the inside of the rails was clear, and I came back and did this several times during the curing and drying process just to make sure the plaster didn't move back into that space. With an overnight or longer dry cure complete, it was time to pull up the tape. The foam wasn't always compliant, so I did have to use a utility knife and a scraper to remove as much of the foam as possible. Any that was left behind would just be covered with scenicking materials and made into like a little bump or hill. Now the sanding. Drywall compound isn't designed to dry smooth. You have to use sandpaper. Just make sure to sweep and vacuum the dust as you go and to taper the road edges. The big concrete pad for the gravel company was a bit trickier. I used flat sandpaper where it was flat, and I used sandpaper wrapped around dowels and a utility knife to get all the plaster down to what looked good to my eye. The round dowels were used in between the tracks so that I could have flange and I could have coupling clearance on the tracks. Now here's what the covered bridge looks like with its single lane coming from 2 lanes to a single lane, all in white plaster. Speaking of white plaster, now it's time to paint. For the gravel company pad, I mixed up a light gray color from cheap acrylic paints and just made sure I got full coverage. You can see that I also built up some ramps to line up with the 2 main building entrances, and they got painted gray as well. On the trackage, I decided that the concrete should have some railroad staining. I mean, really, what railroad doesn't have oil and stuff leaking from its cars and engines? So for this, I used a mixture of sepia and black inks over the gray and used a coarse china brush just to feather and soften the effect while leaving plenty of ink down into the grooves for the wheel flanges. Even though much of this will be covered by the gravel company hoppers, I thought it would make for a more realistic working scene. For the tar roads, I tried Woodland Scenic's asphalt paint. It's not easy to dispense from the tube. There was a big dried plug in there, so once I got that out, it was okay. But the dry time is super short, so you need to work kind of fast and in small sections. And because it is quick dry time, once it was dry, I came back and I could see areas that were not fully covered. The white was still showing through. That had to get a second coat, and when all of it was finally dry, it was really dark, like freshly applied tar. What I did is I came back with 120 grit sandpaper and tried to lighten up the color a little bit. It worked okay, but in the end I came back in with some black and white inks and lightly dry brushed all the road surfaces. On the eastern side, I'll continue to use the same paint just for consistency, but if I need more roads for any future layouts, I'm pretty sure I'll just pre-tint the plaster and also use gray acrylic paints to paint the surface. It's just far easier and cheaper to use. Speaking of paints, it's time to get some lane markings down. For the railroad crossings, I cut a mask using the wife's Cricut machine. And then I came back and using white acrylic paint, cheap white acrylic paint, and a dry brush, I tapped off most of the paint and then came back and tapped it over the mask. I didn't want a crisp, clean line. I kind of wanted a little weathered and beat up. And the first mask, you can see here, came off very clean, and I liked what it looks like. But when I went to pull up the second mask, the Woodland Scenic paint came up with it. So 2 lessons learned here. 1, don't use Woodland Scenic paint with stencils. And 2, cut the stencils or masks from modeling masking tape. They have less adhesion for pulling the paint up. So after some touch-up painting and reapplying the white, here's the look I achieved. I think it looks pretty good. I'll have at least one more of these crossings to paint for the eastern side. Now on to the most tedious part of painting, the center line stripe. For end scale, I cut down Tamiya tape into strips of 1/32 and 1/64 thickness using my easy cutting guide. Now the guide only measures things in millimeters and silly euro units, so I had to compromise in my conversion and use 0.4 and 0.5 millimeter strips. What I did was lay the thicker strip right down the middle of the road where I wanted the center line to be. I then came back and put a thinner strip on either side of the first. These strips will be pulled up once masked to make the actual stripes. When I researched traffic markers and paints, I discovered that uniform codes for colors and markings were not established until the 1970s. Pennsylvania and most other states just used white paint for all the road markings. In addition, very few states use side of the road lines. Once I had those strips in place, I came back and laid thick sections of tape butted up to the outside of the strips. And once I pulled the thinner strips off the surface, I had my double centerline striping ready to be painted. So back to the white paint and dry brush. This part of the project went very quickly, and I kept the amount of paint very light as before. The real magic happens when that center strip is pulled and you can see the double white lining. I hope you enjoyed this quick little layout update, and I'm really excited to run some trains and see how much extra work I created for myself with reliability from all the plaster dust and paint, but that's another story. Oh well, you never really are done working on the railroad, are you? And until next time, happy railroading.